It's a classic bit of trivia. What's the smallest country in the world? Of course, the answer is Vatican City. 0.44 square kilometers in area, a population of little over 450. No other independent nation even comes close. But while this is going to win you the point at your local pub quiz, is it really the case? Vatican City, governed by the Holy See, might be small in stature, but its influence is staggering. As the headquarters of the Catholic Church, this microstate is the focal point of belief and worship for some 1.3 billion people around the world. The country's sovereign, currently Pope Francis, the 266th holder of this title, is one of the most recognizable and influential leaders on the global stage. So, the world's smallest country? Well, this all depends on your definition of the word small. The Vatican's status as a center for religious observance and a site of enormous cultural significance has never been in doubt. Each year, millions of people from across the globe flock to the Vatican. Many are Catholics, eager to experience the grandeur and glory of the seat of their faith. Many others are simply tourists who lose themselves in the sprawling art collections and astounding architecture of this remarkable enclave in the middle of Rome. But the Vatican City is a political entity too. It may not have a seat at the UN, but it has permanent observer status there and regularly issues statements on political and social issues affecting our world. It's one of the few countries that recognizes Taiwan as a nation independent from China. This is not a state afraid to get its hands dirty in international affairs. In 1979, the true power and influence of the Vatican was put to the test. A failed diplomatic intervention, a breakdown of communication between capitals, two countries on the brink of conflict with nowhere left to turn. Analyzing the wars of Latin America in depth, we'll tell the story of that moment, the time the Vatican stopped a full-scale war. The southern tip of South America, thousands of miles from Rome and the Vatican. A wild and rugged expanse of soaring peaks and daunting rock faces. This is Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, and for centuries it was deemed wholly inhospitable for human settlement. The Spanish gave it a try, founding Ciudad del Rey Don Felipe on the Straits of Magellan in 1584. The fact that this settlement is now in ruins and is known as Puerto del Hambre, or Port Famine, gives us an idea of how that turned out. Inhospitable, maybe, but strategically vital. Centuries before the Panama Canal, the only way ships could navigate from the Atlantic coast of the Americas to the Pacific coast was to brave the harsh conditions down here in the southern oceans. Either that, or go the long way around on a risky, expensive, and time-consuming circumnavigation mission. The land might be uninhabitable, but the passage between oceans was crucial and needed to be controlled. By the mid-19th century, colonization of a new kind was underway. Spain was a spent force in South America, and in the first few decades of the century, the country's former holdings fell like dominoes, gaining independence and self-determination after hundreds of years of European rule. Technology had changed too. Suddenly, the deathly chill and savage conditions of the Tierra del Fuego were not the barriers they used to be, and newly independent nations like Chile and Argentina began looking south for new territories and new opportunities. Chile founded Fuerte Bulnes on the Straits of Magellan in 1843 before moving a settlement to nearby Punta Arenas in 1848. In 1869, Argentina's Ushuaia settlement saw its first permanent European settlers, and in 1884 it was incorporated as a territory. The two countries sought to exert what each thought to be its own right of control over the passages joining the Atlantic to the Pacific. The southernmost passage, the open ocean Drake Passage, was still considered dangerous and unreliable. The northernmost, the Magellan Strait, was claimed by Chile. In between those two was the Beagle Channel, named for the ship that Charles Darwin took on his famous voyage to South America in the 1830s. Argentina had a settlement on the channel, Ushuaia, but Chile asserted claims over the western extent of the passage. In 1881, Keen to avoid conflict and lay the groundwork for international maritime trade, both parties signed a new boundary treaty. The northern shore of the Beagle Channel, as far west as the land border between two nations, would be Argentinian. The southern shore, and all territory west of the land border, would be Chilean. The archipelago further south, beyond Cape Horn, would be split in two. Both Chile and Argentina worked together to chart the Beagle Channel and find its deepest point, agreeing to a border that followed this line. All seemed fairly clear and good-natured, except for three small issues: the islands of Picton, Nueva, and Lennox. Years of toing and froing, of drawing and redrawing boundaries, left no one any the wiser as to who owned what. A new century dawned, and the status of these three islands at the eastern mouth of the Beagle Channel remained unsolved. On the morning of June 9th, 1958, a lone lighthouse shines its beacon out across the wintry seas of the Beagle Channel. The light scans the grey waters, providing comfort and solace to the crews that will pass here, showing them the way, guiding them along a safe passage. But for the crew of the Argentinian destroyer ARA San Juan, the beacon does not represent comfort, solace, or guidance. It's nothing more than a target. As the light dawned with the new day, the San Juan trained its 120mm guns on the lighthouse and wiped it off the map. Later that day, an Argentine naval infantry company landed on Snipe Island. The shelling and subsequent invasion of Snipe Island were the latest and most dramatic in a series of tit-for-tat incidents on the tiny islet southwest of Picton. In January, a Chilean military engineer unit landed on the disputed island and built a lighthouse there. At some point over the next few months, the timeline is disputed by both sides as well as the territory itself, the Chilean lighthouse was destroyed and replaced by an Argentine one. In early May, the Argentinian lighthouse was, quite remarkably, seized by a Chilean patrol and taken into custody in Chile, while the remains of the original Chilean structure were fished out of the sea. By June 8th, a new Chilean lighthouse was up and running, but Argentine forces were ready. The following day, the San Juan turned up. The Snipe incident, as it would become known, was a relatively minor dispute. Both parties agreed that the territorial status of Snipe Island was uncertain and that no economic or infrastructural activities should take place there. Argentina withdrew its troops, and everything went back to the way it was before. But a minor dispute is still a dispute, particularly when armed forces are involved. Argentina had demonstrated that she was very happy to use military force to claim what she believed was rightfully hers, while Chile had shown that it was serious about developing its interests at the eastern end of the Beagle Channel. Snipe was the biggest escalation in tensions in the region to date, but it wouldn't be for long. The second half of the 20th century was a period of great political turmoil in both countries. From the downfall of the Perons to a fractious democracy in the 1960s, then the return of a Peronist dictatorship and the military junta of the 1970s, Argentina was split between the right and left-wing totalitarians and the democratic constitutionalists. Chile, in the meantime, was lurching from government to government and ideology to ideology until it experienced a military coup of its own in 1973, with the assassination of President Allende and the installation of a martial dictatorship. Against all this internal tumult, the Beagle Channel might seem like little more than a sideshow. But territory is territory, economics is economics, and control is control. Throughout the domestic crises that rocked both countries in the decades following the Snipe incident, the question of sovereignty and power in the far south remained. In the modern age, the land had taken on a new dimension. The importance of a link between the Pacific and Atlantic remained high, but the territory was now also the gateway to Antarctica, rapidly becoming a hot topic on the world stage. There were also the potential oil reserves and natural resources of the region to think about. Neither Buenos Aires nor Santiago was going to forget about this in a hurry. In 1971, there was still hope for a resolution that both sides could agree on. Chile and Argentina selected 5 judges from the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, at The Hague in the Netherlands, apparently confident that these arbiters could find a mutually acceptable outcome. Both sides stated their intention to abide by the decision of the court and signed a formal agreement to guarantee this. The process was overseen by authorities from the UK. Acting under the jurisdiction of Queen Elizabeth II, the British Crown had no power to modify the court's decision, but it could recommend whether it should be accepted or rejected. Deliberation took years. During this time of uncertainty, Argentina's dictator Juan Perón held talks with his Chilean counterpart Augusto Pinochet in 1974, the only time the two would meet. The Beagle Channel, as well as the maritime boundary set up at the eastern end of the Magellan Straits, were up for discussion, and both sides seemed committed to a peaceful resolution. Perón would die of a heart attack later that year, and ongoing political upheaval in Argentina would do little to help the cause of peace. In 1977, the court finally reached its decision. All the disputed islands belonged to Chile. Argentina, under the terms of the 1971 agreement, had to accept. But the churning discord at the heart of Argentinian politics cast everything into doubt. The 1971 agreement was signed by then-President Alejandro Lanusse. The return of Juan Perón in 1973 and the military coup in 1976 meant that the Argentina bound by the agreement was very different to the one that had signed it 6 years later. Jorge Rafael Videla, a lieutenant general and leader of Argentina's new military junta, was not going to roll over so easily. Videla and Pinochet returned to the negotiating table. Pinochet asserted the validity of the 1977 arbitration, while Videla extended his own claim over the southern and eastern parts of Tierra del Fuego. Neither would budge, and as men who had been swept to power as the result of direct military action, both were happy to consider the use of force as a very real possibility. Videla, encouraged by the numerical advantage of his armies as well as recent purchases of warships from Europe, struck first. On December 22, 1978, Argentina launched Operation Soberanía, or Sovereignty. This would be a naval engagement and a full-scale invasion of the disputed islands, claiming them once and for all for Argentina. Chile, fully aware of Argentine troop movements and ready to defend the rugged terrain with a well-equipped and formidably well-trained army of its own, dug in and waited. And they waited. Bad weather delayed the Argentine invasion by a day, and what happened next is still up for debate. According to Argentina, the invaders crossed the disputed border, occupied territory, and then withdrew. According to others, the Argentine fleet had already begun its retreat before invasion forces crossed any border lines, and the operation was aborted before it even began. The story of the Beagle Channel conflict is fraught with disagreement and dispute. The islands are disputed, the timeline of the snipe incident is disputed, and the very nature of Argentina's botched invasion is disputed. But there are certainties here. International arbitration had failed. Both sides were mobilized and ready for action, and two nations, home to tens of millions of Catholics, were stumbling ever closer to all-out war. This was enough for the Vatican. Shocked by the escalation of events in South America, Pope John Paul II was spurred into action. As the aborted Operation Soberanía was still unfolding, he sent a personal envoy to Chile and Argentina in a desperate attempt to defuse the situation. The Vatican City, the world's smallest nation-state by quite a distance, was about to make its influence felt on the world stage. Vatican intervention in the Beagle Channel conflict would need to be different from that which had gone before. The time for a slow process of arbitration, lasting years, was gone. What the region needed was an end to hostilities immediately. It was Cardinal Antonio Samore who was tasked with making this happen. Running missions of shuttle diplomacy back and forth from Santiago to Buenos Aires, Samoré opened communications channels between the two nations. In an impressively skillful bit of diplomatic maneuvering, Samoré was able to bring the powder keg of regional politics under control, at least temporarily. On January 8, 1979, barely 2 weeks after invasion forces had massed on the disputed border, Samoré oversaw the Act of Montevideo, as both parties put pen to paper on yet another agreement. Only this time, it was different. This was never intended to be an end to the matter. a sticking plaster to cover a festering wound of economic and territorial disharmony. It was an emergency measure designed to prevent what had seemed like inevitable bloodshed on a huge scale. As part of the act, Samoré requested that the two states will not resort to the use of force in their mutual relations, will bring about a gradual return to the military situation existing at the beginning of 1977, and will refrain from adopting measures that might impair harmony in any sector. There was no "this belongs to X and that belongs to Y", there was only a concerted effort toward peace and an immediate downclimb from the brink of war. Samoré's mission was a huge success, but there was more work to be done. On March 4th, the Pope invited delegations from both sides to meet an audience at the Vatican. The Pope was in attendance, observing the proceedings with great interest. But once again, it was Cardinal Samore who served as peacemaker. The Vatican City, the Holy See, and the office of the papacy were now embroiled in a long-term project, something that would bring peace, real, lasting peace, not just a fragile ceasefire, to the region. For months, Samore and his team gathered information from both sides, analyzing and assessing the claims, the requests, the grievances, and the relative positions of both the Chilean and Argentine camps. The representatives were asked to put forward their own ideas for how a workable solution could be reached, which they did later in the year, but once again, the two parties could not see eye to eye and talks floundered. By December 1980, almost 2 years after the Act of Montevideo, the Pope stepped in. He issued his La Propuesta, or proposal. Disputed territories would be awarded to Chile, but Argentina would be permitted to support its own interests by operating civilian radar and weather stations on these islands. Argentina would also have navigation rights through the channels and straits connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Chile was happy to accept. Argentina was not. The 1980s began with a glimmer of hope for the resolution of a long-standing crisis, but this rapidly faded. In 1981, Pope John Paul II entered St. Peter's Square in Vatican City and was greeted by the usual throngs of visitors. Among those visitors was Mehmet Ali Agca, a Turkish national who produced a gun and fired, severely wounding the pontiff. Pope John Paul made a complete recovery, but his future public activities and appearances would be heavily influenced by this brush with death. In 1982, Argentina would experience a stinging defeat at the hands of the British after the invasion of the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas, to the southeast of Tierra del Fuego, dealing a heavy blow to her military prowess in the region. In the sudden scramble to gain control of the South Atlantic, Argentina repeatedly violated territory claimed by Chile, essentially occupying some of the lands awarded to their rivals. At the same time, the conflict strengthened ties between Chile and the United Kingdom, further isolating the nation of Argentina. Less than a year later, Cardinal Antonio Samore died of a heart attack in Rome, aged 77. Across 3 short years, a seemingly unrelated chain of disaster, violence, and death would bring the Beagle Channel peace process to its knees. But all was not quite lost. Samore may not have lived to see the final product of his diplomatic efforts, but it would come. By December 1983, the now democratic Argentina had a new president, Raúl Alfonsín. He, like his people, was sick of war and the threat of war, and resolving the dispute with neighbors Chile became a top priority. The following April, the Vatican once again requested 2 separate proposals from Chile and Argentina, and by October, the 2 nations had finally found common ground. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship, signed in 1984, laid the groundwork for what would follow. In early 1985, the terms of the agreement passed through the various bodies of legislature in Santiago and Buenos Aires and were signed by a representative of Alfonsín and by Pinochet himself. On May 2nd, the treaty was finalized. The modern border between Argentina and Chile at the southern tip of South America is a complex one. It has to be. With such rugged and inhospitable terrain, borders are pegged to natural landmarks and boundaries, from mountain ranges to ocean passes. But it's not just the unique physical geography that has drawn these borders. More than a century of political wrangling and territorial dispute has played its part too. Disputes that almost spilled over into military confrontation on at least a couple of occasions. Where local talks and international intervention failed, the Vatican succeeded, and more than 30 decades of peace are testament to what the world's smallest nation is really capable of. Heading east from Osorno in Chile along the Pan-American Highway beyond Entre Lagos, the road rises through the Andean mountain range toward the border. Beyond this point, the Chilean route 215CH gives way to the Ruta Nacional 231 on the Argentinian side of the border, and the Pan-American rolls on toward Via La Angostura and San Carlos de Bariloche. Today, this is a busy route, as trucks shuttle back and forth from destinations on either side of the divide. But in 1978, as Operation Soberanía unfolded, it almost became a battle line. It was through this pass that Luciano Benjamin Menendez led his 3rd Army Corps, moving from Argentinian Patagonia toward Chilean territory in the west. Whether Menendez's forces actually crossed into Chile is up for debate, but for a few tense hours, it looked as if the slide toward all-out conflict was unavoidable. Those traversing the pass these days will find it peaceful, if a little daunting. The well-maintained ribbon of road connecting the two countries is one of the safest and easiest ways to move from southern Argentina into southern Chile, and vice versa. And the journey is a popular choice for modern travelers exploring a truly stunning and often overlooked part of the world. But visitors might notice something else too: the name of the pass. The Paso Cardinal Antonio Samore is what this connection is called these days, named in honor of the man who, at the behest of the Pope, averted crisis on an enormous scale. It's a fitting reminder of the time the Vatican showed the world just what it could do and achieved a remarkable political victory where so many others had failed. But what do you think? How close did Argentina and Chile really come to all-out war in 1978? Could anything have been done earlier to avert this close call? And is there anything that we may have missed in the video? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.